Good evening, everyone. My name is TK Kugler. I am the founder and managing partner of Wasabi Ventures Stables. And we are having a webinar tonight, probably about the topic. I think there are two topics in horse racing that are the most misunderstood in all of the game. And when I talk about being misunderstood, they're even misunderstood by people who think they really understand the game. And tonight, the one we're covering is the race entry process. And it is probably misunderstood because if you were drawing up how to design a system, the racing entry process is probably as badly designed as you could dream up. But like many things in horse racing, it's how they've always done it, so it stays with us. But we're going to cover how, from an idea of a race to all the way to an entry getting created and a race card created, how that process happens. And we're going to cover every aspect of that sort of at the entry process level. At times, I'm going to say things like, we're going to talk about condition books. And I'm not going to go into how to read a condition book because, frankly, we have a really great webinar we've already done on that. You can look it up on our YouTube channel and watch that. Or we're not going to cover some of the strategy things that go into, why certain entries happen the way they do, because I have a really good webinar that talks about this. This webinar will solely cover how does an entry happen, what is the logistical process that's happening on the back end, and a little bit of what you can learn from that if you read between the lines. And so, without further ado, I'm going to jump right in. And I'm going to share my screen so you can see some of the things that I'll be talking about. And once again, don't hesitate to ask a question at any point. Use the chat functionality. So when races happen, most of the time, what you see is that if you're a racing fan, you're familiar with a racing card, and a race card has a bunch of races listed with their horses on them. What you don't know, if you're just a casual fan, and frankly, even if you're a fairly astute and knowledgeable fan, is that there's an entire entry process that happens before we even get to a race. And what that entails is what I'm going to describe tonight. And where it all starts with is something called a condition book. And literally, the compound sort of word, although I guess in English it wouldn't be considered a compound word, but the two words are exactly what it sounds like. It's a book, a physical book, and yes, they still print these in physical books. In the digital world, they still print them, but there are books. If you walk into any racing office, you can find yourself a condition book. And what that book is, it's made up of a list of conditions of races that are going to happen in the future. So that's what a condition book is. And every racetrack puts out a condition book. Usually it covers a month to 2 months of time period, sometimes 6 weeks, sometimes a whole meet if a meet is only 5 or 6 weeks long, depending on the racetrack. And it lists all of the races. And so if you have a horse, you need to review a condition book and decide what race it fits for. And so what I'm showing you is Equibase. Equibase is sort of the holder of all data in the racing world. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. If you're not, just go to equibase.com, putz around on it. You'll find all kinds of things that you never realized existed in the racing world, but it's where all data sits. It's owned and run by the Jockey Club, and you can follow your own politics on that if you care. So, but I pulled up, and tonight we're actually going to go through some of Wasabi horses that are actually in races and learn the process of an entry by looking at actual horses that we have that are in races in upcoming, and look at it sort of from backwards forward. So I'm going to pull up Laurel Park. Laurel Park is just getting ready to start their meet. The Pimlico meet just ended. So we have a horse in this Friday. One of the good guys is in this Friday at Laurel, and we're going to come back and you'll see it in the entries. But it all starts from a condition book. You can go to Equibase, look up any racetrack, and find their condition book. Okay, and so you can find that by once you get here. There's 3 tabs down here and the other information, and you'll see them listed right here in this thing called a condition books. Right there is where you see that, and so there are 2 things to keep a look. So you'll see the dates, 5/31 to 6/30. So they put out a condition book. They published a condition book for a month of racing. And there are 2 parts to it. And then there's this word index. Why in the world they couldn't put that all together into one file, I have no idea. But they don't. They actually have it as 2 separate files. And so we're going to start with the index. So I'm going to click the index. Hopefully all of you can see this. And you'll see a list, a true, just like it sounds, an index of all of the races in the condition book. 2-year-olds, and they break it out by category for you: 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 2-year-olds, and 5-year-olds, 3-year-olds and up races. Same thing on the filly side. Okay, and so one of the good guys is the racing question that he's kind of looking for, and this is kind of a trick, and it's the first thing you'll learn here about races. But let's just say he's going to go in an allowance race, and he's a Maryland bred, so he's going to be in a Maryland restricted race. That's what this little MD means, because he's Maryland bred, so he can be in a Maryland restricted race, and it's an allowance level, and that's a non-winners of 2 in life allowance race. And we'll dig into the conditions, but you might say, and if you'll notice, they're broken down by short and long. Now, you might be looking at this index as a knowledgeable person and say, TK, I don't understand at all how you can decide what race you're going to be in just by looking at that. Well, what is short? Is it 5.5 furlongs? Is it 6.5 furlongs? Both of those might be considered short, right? Is it 6 furlongs? Is it 4.5 because you're running to Charlestown? Who the heck knows? And my answer is, you hit the nail on the head. This index does very little for you except give you general direction, and then you have to go back and forth and back and forth. Completely efficient, correct? Wrong. Completely inefficient. Makes no sense at all. But we could have this all in a database, but it doesn't exist in a database anywhere. It exists in books. And so, once again, so this is the art of learning condition book. And once again, we're only looking at one track right now. We're looking at Laurel. Okay. So, but staying with the exercise here, I might say, oh, I want him to go short. I think he's going to run short. He hasn't really shown that he's a 1.25 mile horse or something. He's a short. He's been running short. So this allowance race looks like maybe they got one. Oh, here's one on the 31st that they call long. But what's long? Well, we'll go look. So once you get a general direction, you say, oh, that might be a race that fits my horse. Then you go over back. If we hit the back button for a second, you go back to other information. You can hit the actual condition book. Now, I went ahead just to keep speed going, got us to that date. Now, this is the actual condition book that I'm showing you here. And we jumped. Remember, there was a race on May 31st. That's this Friday. Remember, I told you we're working backwards. So one of the good guys is here 31st. So it must be a race that's happening on that day, right? So, because remember, we said May 31st, he's in. So I come here to notice is that it says entries close on Saturday, May 25th, 2024. So from an entry process, if we are in a race on May 31st, we had to enter that race on May 25th. So once again, 6 days ahead of time, we have to know. And every every race, if I would scroll up, no matter what day I choose, there's probably they'll tell you which day the entries take place. So to enter the race for this race on May 31st, we had to call the racing office, say, hello, I'm Mark Salvaggio, because the trainer is the person that calls. An owner can call, but you'll literally be considered the craziest owner in America, and almost no trainer is going to want to work for you. But so the trainer calls and says, "Hey, I'm Mark Salvaggio. I have horse X. I have one of the good guys. He's in. I want to enter him in." And he would tell you what race it is. So he would look down in the condition book. Now we're going to scroll through here, and what's going to get you is not the race that one of the good guys is in, which is going to be a 6 furlong Maryland restricted allowance race, does not exist in the condition book. And now you're going to say, TK, you're an idiot. You just told me that the race was in the condition book because that's where all the races are. Well, yes and no. All of the listed races that they had scheduled a month ahead of time and we're going to think about having are in the condition book. But there is something known as an overnight, and we'll get to that in a second, that lists extra races that they might just want to fill on a spur of the moment. So you have to read the overnight as well. Same process though. Mark Salvaggio calls. He says, I want to run in race X. And he would give you the number. I want to run, just for hypothetical, I want to run in race 4 with one of the good guys. He will be wearing blinkers. So he has to tell them the equipment that he's wearing as well. He's wearing blinkers, he's wearing a shadow roll, whatever equipment the horse has, he has to name it at that point. And he also has to name who the jockey is. His first listed jockey up. So he would say, I'm riding, Frankie Dettori is coming in town, and he's going to pick up one of the good guys as a mount. If you watch the Preakness ride from Frankie Dettori, you probably don't want him riding one of the good guys, but whatever. Just for fun, we'll say Frankie Dettori is going to pick up the mount. So, and that's what Mark Salvaggio would do. And the racing secretary on the other side, or racing office personnel, different tracks use different people for the entries, would take it and say, okay, sounds good. I got you down. And he literally would put that horse on a list, and that racing secretary spends all day trying to get the list ready. And if you'll notice, remember, we're in the condition book here. There are 16 listed races in here. Now you'll say, well, there's no way, TK, because they didn't have 16 races on the card. As a matter of fact, we'll go look at the card now. Once again, I'm jumping back to Equibase. I'm going to look at the entries for Friday, because once again, we're working backwards here. I think it's race. Did I go past it? No, I don't think I got to it. There, yeah, right there. So it's race 8. On the whole card on Friday, there are only 9 races. Remember, the condition book has 16 races listed. So what the racing secretary is taking all those entries, and then the racing secretary on their own determines and says, I have 6 entries for this race, and I have 2 entries for this race. Well, obviously I can't have a race with 2 entries, so I'm going to use this race. And that's what they decided to do. Now, once again, if you remember, let's look at this condition. An allowance race, restricted for Maryland bred or sired, but it's only going 6 furlongs. Remember, we looked at the condition book. There's no such race in the condition book because there's this thing called an overnight, which we'll hit the back button for. There's this thing called an overnight. And what the racing office does, remember, they had 16 races to choose from. They didn't use them all. But let's say they want to get one of those races. They stick them on this thing called an overnight, like right here. And these are the extra races. Now, in this example, there are literally 5 extra races. So there were 16 listed races, 5 extra races, That makes 21 races, but only 9 of them get used in this example. That should boggle your mind already. Is why the heck do we need 21 races to just get 9 to go? And the reason being is that candidly, most racing offices don't really understand their backside and which horses they have there. Even though they have software that tracks that, they don't do a great job of building a condition book that matches what they actually have. So they have to just keep creating races, hoping they can fill something. So as an owner, if you're out there, and now this is where now that you get the general process of the first phase here, the racing office, we looked at the condition book, we looked at an overnight, our trainer called and entered the racing secretary is going to choose the 9 best races that he wants to fill. He or she, there are female racing secretaries, quite a few of them actually, and then they determine what races they're going to use, and they make it. That's first step of the process. Now, but let's flip it on and talk a little bit about our own perspective as an owner. What you should take away here is once again, there were 21 races. They only used 9 of them. And many of you, I know, get frustrated, and as I do, but are also confused of, I don't understand, TK, you keep saying that we entered our horse in race X and it doesn't get used. How is that possible? That's because every day there's about 12 to, and sometimes there are even more, 15 extra races that don't get used. The racing office just decides not to use them. And then you're stuck missing a race. Even though it was in the condition book, even if it was listed as race number 1, which in theory means it's the most preferential race by a racing office, it should get filled the first and foremost, just from a preference standpoint. Doesn't mean anything, candidly. Anything could happen there and a race won't get filled. And then you miss that race, and then you miss the next race that doesn't go. And that can go on for a very long time. And it's a very frustrating thing. So as an owner, sometimes then you just gotta put your horse into any race. And I have a really good video that I talk about some of the extreme situations, but that's why often fillies will have to run against the boys, right? It's not that they want to run against the boys. They just couldn't get their own race to go, so they had to go. Our record, I think, is 16 entries with a horse where it didn't go. 16 times we entered a horse consecutively, the same horse, and a race didn't go for it. So it's not uncommon that a race won't go or won't fill, right? If you enter a race and it doesn't even get back on the overnight, then you're doomed, because that probably means only 1 or 2 horses entered that race at all. So you had no chance. If it doesn't at least get used on the overnight, because in the overnight, then you got, it was 5 or 6. They just didn't use it. We get 1 or 2 more and it'll get on the next card. Now, coming back to one of the good guys, here's the next nuance. We had no interest in entering the race at all. One of the good guys that just ran pretty well, ran a nice race for an off the turf race, ran second, came out of the race in great order. And the very next day, Laurel's racing office called Mark Salvaggio and said, hey, listen, saw you got one of the good guys. We're trying to fill a race. Would you mind entering right now to have him go in this race so we can fill it? If you notice on the entries, there were only 6 horses in this field. They were desperate to fill this race. They wanted to fill their card because they just needed a horse. And so Mark called me, said, hey, what do you think? I said, well, if the horse came back okay, go ahead and enter, as long as they don't give us days or penalties. If he's not okay in 3 or 4 days, we could scratch. Who cares? That's called hustling. They will hustle a race. A racing office will start calling around randomly trainers. Hey, I see you have this horse in the barn. I've got this race. It's got 5. You'll make 6. If you're 6, it'll go. And then you have to decide, well, do I go in that race? I didn't plan to go in that race. Is the horse ready to go? But if they're calling, now sometimes they'll hustle you. they'll hustle you in a spot because they're doing a favor for somebody else. It's all politics. They've got their favorite trainer who's got a easy horse who's going to win this damn race, and they just need to fill it so they can take care of their nice favorite trainer and use you as cannon fodder to get the race to go. Now, you have to make the decision. Now, it doesn't hurt to do a favor for a racing office, right? I mean, in theory, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. I will tell you 95% of the time, karma in the racing world doesn't necessarily work that way. You got a better chance of getting the middle finger from that racing secretary next time, unless you're one of their favorite trainers. But, it's always nice to be a good person. So, but in this case, for one of the good guys, it made a lot of sense. And once again, we could scratch without a problem. It didn't, I mean, if it came up and it was a salty race and we were going to get smoked and it was on short rest and he wasn't ready, we scratch. We're not going to ship down and we don't have to worry about it. But it did come up at 6. We got a great post. He's doing well after the race that he just had. And we can go down and pick up a nice purse possibly. So more than likely, unless something changes in the next couple of days, we're going to run. So coming back to the entry process, we just covered the first sort of steps. The last step that happens is when the card itself gets made. Now you'll notice, I'm going to go back and look at the entries here, and you'll notice that our race was, I think it's race 8, featured race of the day, as a matter of fact. You'll notice that, let's just take this first race. There are 10 horses in the field, and there are 2 AEs. Eligibles, meaning they're not officially in the race unless somebody scratches. Okay, so how did these horses get chosen to be in the race? Right, you said the race the trainer just calls, puts their entry in, and says, "Oh, I want to enter this race." How did they do? So for non-stakes races, we're going to get to stakes races next, but for non-stakes races, the usual preference, because there's a preference, is actually the date that the horse's papers, like their official papers, their jockey club papers, are sent to the racing office. So the older your date, meaning you committed your papers to Laurel, the earlier date you have, the higher preference you have to get in a race. So these 2 AEs down here probably have dates that are younger or newer than the 10 horses that did get in the race. So now papers are all digital now. So, but you can only have your papers at 1 track at a time. So if you are, let's say you are stabled at Penn, let's take one of the good guys. He's stabled at Penn. His papers are officially at Penn right now. He has no date at Laurel. But his race only has 6 horses, so it didn't matter, that preference. If we had tried to enter into this race, the odds are that one of the good guys could have not got in the race. Of course, it's fillies and mares, so he couldn't get in the race no matter what. But let's just stay with the hypothetical because it has AEs. His date would have not gave him the preference to get in. So he would have been on the also eligible list, or maybe he would have been the 13th horse listed and not even on the also eligible list. So that date thing is important for any race that is not a stakes race. Stakes race have a different system altogether, which we'll get to. Let me just check real quick. We had some chat here. Bearshang asks, are their tracks more notorious for condition books not matching what actually goes? No, they're all terrible, Mary. They're 100% all terrible. There's nobody that's good or bad at doing this. They're just really bad. Now, in fairness to them, they have a shrinking horse population, and they're trying to get races to go, and they're trying to hustle. But there's none of them are really good at this. Now, of course, candidly, even tracks that you think are sort of like a Churchill Downs, they'll hustle races all the time. We've gotten calls on horses. Hey, do you want to ship to Churchill Downs to run? Usually some kind of an allowance or type race or something. But we've gotten calls and, you know, do you want to ship 6 hours to race? Because your horse seems to have fit. We got one for Keeneland this year. As a matter of fact, they were trying to hustle us to a race. So, so they're all kind of equally bad. Amy K asked, using one of the good guys and his race at Laurel as an example, how much is the entry fee going to cost, or where do you find the entry fee for a race? Is it in the condition book or the overnight? That is a magnificent question and probably one of the most misunderstood pieces, Amy. There is absolutely no cost to enter any race except for a stakes race. No cost. I think it is probably the number one thing that people misunderstand because they think that it costs money to enter a race. It costs nothing to enter a race except for a stakes race, which once again we're going to look at next. They're different, and that's probably one of the most unique things to learn. Gary Quill asked, how far in advance are the overnight races posted ahead of the entry deadline? Super question, Mr. Gary. Usually, I think I have an overnight here open, or I had one open. Usually what happens when the entries come out for a race, so if they were taking entries for Friday, let's say Sunday's race, when they publish that overnight, I'm just going to go back and look at an overnight real quick. I'll look at the latest Sunday's overnight. And it's a little different from track to track, but generally it's the same. You'll notice here, this is the overnight. This is the latest overnight from Laurel. They are taking entries on June 1st. So the overnight came out for entries on June 1st, for races on June 7th. And these are the they're just 4. Yes, there are 4 overnight races there. So that's probably the longest stretch. Now, if this was like a Friday for a Saturday, there's probably only 1 day separating there. But this is Sunday to a Friday. So there's quite a bit of timeline there. So that usually whatever the day is, the last day that they had entries, the very next day that they're taking entries is when the overnight comes out. Good questions. All of you asked very good questions. So finishing up how the race gets selected. So those 12 horses, coming back to our situation here at the top, our 10 horses that are in, what they do is they literally have a drawing, and they have a little pill box, and all of the jockey agents are in the room. It's usually jockey agents, sometimes it's trainers, but it's almost always just the jockey agents because they're trying to figure out which of their jockeys are getting in which races. And the racing secretary shakes up the pill box and pulls out the numbers, and he'll say, and he has a bunch of cards, and he writes, each entry has a number on the back, and he'll say number 10. And so in this case, Molly of Stratford pulled the number 10 pill, and she got the 10 hole there. And so then they call that out, and they just go all the way down the order to get through all the 10. And so it's all randomized, old-fashioned. Think of ping pong balls. They call them pills. They're little, always red. I think, well, I've seen green ones too, I guess, but usually red. And they each have a number on it, and whatever number comes out, that's who gets that post position. So it's completely random. Is how that works. And then this card comes out and everybody sees it. And that's the card you see when you see your past performances. And that's the end-to-end process from an entry to a race. And as you can see, lots of sort of strategies and things happening there. Does a race fill, not fill? And you also get to learn, like, for example, as an owner, once again, thinking of yourself as an owner, because you all are, if you think about being an owner, you get to learn that certain races fill, like cheap races fill. Non-2 life $5,000 claiming races always fill, because everybody's got cheap horses. That race is going to get a dozen horses entered at almost every track everywhere, because that's what most horses are. They're cheap horses. But getting that specialty allowance race going long on the dirt, don't hold your breath, because that ain't easy to fill. which is why one of the good guys got the phone call. They wanted that race to go. Now, if I dig in a little bit, I would probably figure out why they wanted that race to go. I'm pretty sure they got a friend in there and they needed that race to go. Now, I think we're pretty well positioned to win that race. So, hopefully we get to stick it to that friend, which nothing feels better than that when you get to do that. But that's why they hustled the race. They wanted that race to go, and they needed a sixth horse to justify it. Is really what it came down to. So that's the end for everything but stakes races. But now we're going to jump into stakes races, which have a very similar but different process. So, Wasabi's got 3 stakes horses running this weekend. Cards just came out. We have Penn National has a really big stakes card this weekend, and we have 3 horses running in 2 of the stakes races up there. And so the way the process works in stakes racing is a little different. It's a extra step process. The first step is what's known as the nomination phase, and this usually comes out way ahead of time. I would guess nominations for this stakes race. This is what a stakes nomination form looks like. And this is the actual stake that we have 2 horses. We have not 1, but 2 horses in this race. It comes out like this, and you can find these on Equibase. You can go to any track, look at the other information, and you'll see a list of all their stakes, and you'll see nomination forms that look something like this. Every track, of course, does them a little differently. And so way ahead of time, if you'll notice, this race was being run or will be run on May 31st, but nominations closed on May 15th. So if you remember what I just described about the entry process, stakes races have an extra step known as nominating, which happens usually 2 weeks before the race, sometimes even longer, but usually I would say 2 weeks before the race. And that's what we have here. So we nominated our horses in this case, one called Could Be a Cougar, and the other one, a horse named Fee, into this race, and we nominated them. And the stakes secretary, or stakes coordinator at the racetrack, in the racing office, it's their job to sort of collect these and promote these to get as many good horses nominated as they can into a race. So we filled out this form. Now, if you'll notice, this condition has all kinds of stuff in here. And that's the difference between stakes races and any other kind of race. Allowances, maiden claiming, starter races, whatever. Their conditions are usually what they say, and they cost nothing. But this one will tell you. So if no nomination fee. So this stakes race it didn't cost us anything to nominate. $250 to pass the entry box. So that means for us to enter the race, so the first step is to nominate, cost us nothing. $250 to enter the entry box. Just to enter will cost us $250. And if we actually start the race, it's going to cost us $250 more. So it's $500 into the pot that we had to pay. Now, if you think about historically, that's what stakes races were. That's why they're called stakes races. The owners state, I got a faster horse than you. I'm putting up the money. You put up the money. We'll we'll figure out who has the bigger mouth and who shuts each other up with the fastest horse. And we all put the money in the pot and determine that. And then we split the money up. That's what a stakes race was historically, and that's why it's called that. We stake our horse. So that's what it calls. You can also supplementally nominate. Let's say you missed that May 15th date and you say, I really want to run in this race. Here's $1,000. Put me in the race. Okay? You can do that. That's what a supplemental nomination was. And then it talks about how the purse is going to be distributed. But if you'll come down here, all stakes races have preferences. That date thing that I talked about with all of the other races means nothing for stakes races. That goes out the window because now you're playing the big leagues. it all comes down to money. And preference to horses with the highest earnings in 2024. Starters to be named through the entry box by the usual time of closing, meaning they're just going to use a normal entry process. But if there are 25 horses that want to enter, whoever has the most earnings in 2024 would get preference over anyone else. That's for this. That's the preference for this stakes race. You'll see all kinds of other preferences, lifetime earnings, graded stakes earnings, things like the Kentucky Derby obviously have a point system with a whole series. That's the preference to get into that race. That's what that means. Okay. So the nomination goes in, we put ourselves in on May 15th. The next thing that happens is the nominations on May 16th, or whatever date that goes there. Will list every horse that nominated themselves, or which I'm sure the horse didn't nominate itself, actually. The trainer called and nominated. Once again, owners can also nominate, but only lunatic owners would call and nominate. Just to be clear, there is a funny story of an owner once doing that, and I know the owner and the trainer involved. As a matter of fact, many of you know the owner and the trainer are involved, and the trainer asked the owner to come pick up his horse personally because he would never train it again. Because the owner called and threw him into a stakes race he had no business putting him in. He put him in a graded stakes race when the horse had not even broken its maiden yet, and said, "Yeah, you're not going to do that to me anymore." So, true story. As a matter of fact, it's a club member who was the owner. So, but I digress. So the interesting thing here, if you'll notice, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 horses nominated for this race. Remember, we talked about it. There's probably only, and sometimes they'll tell you how many are going. It's limited to 10 horses. You see it right at the top. So all of a sudden, that preference becomes important. Now, if I dug in here, both Fee and Could Be a Cougar had plenty of earnings, would have easily been in the top 10 no matter what. So we knew if we wanted to race, we were in the race. But if we were sweating it and we were way down the list, let's say we were number 19 and we really wanted to race here, we might not have got in, right? If 11 horses had more earnings than us. So then the entry happens. So now we go to the entry process that happens just like everything else. Like I've already described, there's an entry usually about 5 or 6 days before the race, sometimes a week. You enter your horse, the trainer calls, "Hey, I want to enter Fee in this stakes race. It's already been nominated, blah, blah, blah. We're good to go." Then they do the same thing. They do the pill poll. They give the race. They put the race on the card, and from there, it's a go. But that nomination process is an extra step. It's kind of fun. It's very fun as an owner to look at your horse being nominated and see all the other horses that have been nominated. It's a nice thing to jump into. But once again, once it gets past the nomination phase, it acts just like any other race, using that whatever the preferences are to determine the race. And then in this case, and you can find all of this once again in Equibase. But if we look on Friday night, because this is a Friday night stakes racing here, if we look, I think, so we have a bunch of wasabis here. So let me. But here's that race. The race came up with only 7 horses in it, right? It's a very soft race. We're excited that it's a soft race. We're 2 of the 7 horses right next to each other. Sadly, I think we're both the speed of the race. So, if it comes down to it, hopefully we're not dueling at the front end, helping out this 6 horse, which is a closer. And we are the 3-1 second choice and the 7-2 third choice. But once again, that all happened just like any other of the races. There are maiden races on this list and claiming races on this card, and those were pulled and entry just the same way that I described before. So that's the entry process. Let me just talk a couple jokes here, or anecdotes that are actually interesting. There's an old saying in horse racing that the most dangerous thing on a racetrack is an owner with a condition book. Um, and the reason, now that was probably started by a trainer who didn't want to deal with an owner with a condition book. But the reason that they say that is that most owners have a hard time understanding the level to run their horse. They try to run him over the head. It's sort of like the story I told you about the owner who called and nominated his horse for a graded stakes race that hadn't even broke its maiden yet. That same owner, by the way, nominated his horse for a stakes race when it was boys trying to nominate it for a girls' race, which you obviously can't do. So that owner's pretty special. So, but coming back to the anecdote, the it's a dangerous it's a dangerous thing to run your horse. Not dangerous necessarily to the health of the horse, but dangerous from a perspective that you're not going to have a lot of success. And looking at a condition book and thinking that a race is going to go, now that you understand the entry process, it's not as simple as why didn't this race go? I think we should have run in this race. Why didn't we run in this race? Because sometimes there's a lot of nuances to that. And owners, hopefully, through education like this, you get to understand that it's not as simple as I just pick out a race and that's the race that's going to go. The other thing that I would say is that I have a video on this. You're free to dig into this. We also have a great video done by our very own Gary Quill a few years ago, who's on this webinar about how to read a condition book and how to read conditions of a race. And he talks about handicapping strategies and everything that come from that. It's a really great webinar. It's had tens of thousands of views. You should look it up on YouTube. But one thing to take away is that you don't really get a lot of control over the race that you're going to run in most of the time. Stakes races, of course, are a little different. But if you have even a good allowance horse, you can't just point to a race and think that's going to go. And that's part of the difficulty of this, is that races often don't fill. And that's one of those things that you have to understand, that sometimes you have to accept to run in a race that's not perfect because that's what you have to do. And that's hard for many owners to get their arms around, that sometimes you just got to run even when it's not the perfect race. It might be the wrong distance, it might be the wrong surface, it might be the wrong level, right? Oh, we got to run a little over our head here, but there's no other choice. We've got to go. That's just part of the game. Clarence asked a couple questions. Do our two horses have to run as an entry? That's a great question on entries. About 2 years ago, most tracks got rid of entries, meaning you have the choice to run as an entry or not. But we do not have to run as an entry. We could have forced the hand here and ran as an entry, but we won't in this case. The other thing is the reason most tracks got rid of it or made it optional is that they want to fill races, right? if for example, if we wouldn't have been in this stakes race, we would, if we were an entry, it would have been 6 horses, 6 betting entries. They would rather have 7, just from a betting perspective. And Charlie gave me thanks for talking about the nuances of the entry process. So hopefully that gave you some sense of the entry process and all of the steps that go along with it. I'm a big believer that people should learn about condition books and dig into them. So as owners, dig in, but also understand that hopefully now, after webinars like this, that you understand that it's not as obvious what races you're going to get to go in and which ones you're not going to get to go in. Any last questions? All right. Well, thank you all tonight for coming. And I really appreciate it. And I hope to see all of you on Slack.